Today's daf, we're going to be learning a Shevuot, daf Yud Zayin. Today's daf is dedicated to Mimi and Rafi Shachat on the birth of a daughter. It's Mimi who works for us, so she'll be on maternity leave, which means if there's a little bit of a delay of getting back to everyone about dedications, you'll be forgiving. And until we get into a groove. Okay, but very excited for Mimi. And okay, always nice to have good news. We're going to get started with a slew of questions regarding this idea. Let me just review the details of the Mishnah. We have a person who becomes impure while they're in the temple. Accidentally, they didn't intend to. They become impure while they're in the temple. What they need to do is stay in there not enough time to bow down, which we discussed yesterday exactly what this is. Then they also have to leave in the shortest path possible. So they have to be under the amount of Kadesh Shachava'ah and leave in the shortest way possible. Today, we're going to get into a slew of questions analyzing each of these two parts. First, the Shiur Kadesh Tachava'ah, what if kind of questions, almost like Rabbi Yirmiyah style, even though it's not Rabbi Yirmiyah. And then it's going to be, what about the leaving on the shortest path, the longest path? And we'll see the questions they ask about that. So by Rava, starting from the bottom of Tetzayin and Bet, Tzarich Shehir Malkot, or ain't Tzarich Shehir Malkot? Okay, what Malkot are we talking about? Well, till now, we said the whole thing was unwitting, right? But what if when you're in the temple and you become impure, and then someone says to you, do you know that if you don't get out of the temple right now, and you stay Kadesh Tachava'ah or whatever it is, and they say, if you don't get out right now, you're going to get lashes. And then it becomes intentional because you know and you were warned, and then you could theoretically get lashes. So when they warn you, do you know that you could get lashes for staying in the temple? And then you don't leave right away, but you start to wait. Now, let's say you wait less than shiur shtachava, but you did hesitate and you didn't leave right away. So, right, let's put shiur shtachava at, let's say, 2 minutes, and you stayed a minute. Okay? Now, do we say tzarich shiur, lo tzarich shiur? Do we give you lashes just for staying a minute? Because who said that the issue of bowing had anything to do with intentional once you were warned and for lashes? So that's going to be the question. The korban gemire shia, here are the two sides. This whole thing of shia, of waiting, was specifically to bring a korban in the case where you weren't warned for lashes. It's all considered unwitting. Or lamal, and then the malkot lo gemire shia, but this whole thing of shia had nothing to do with lashes, meaning someone says to you, do you know if you don't get out right now, you're going to get lashes, and you don't get out right that minute, but you don't wait the time needed, the shiur shia, you waited 1 minute, not 2 minutes, will you get the lashes anyway? Or maybe the shiur shehia is the way we define anyone in the temple who's impure. If you waited the time for bowing, you're obligated. If you're not, you're not. So it would be the same for lashes. Okay, that's his question. The first four questions we're going to ask all end in teku. We don't have an answer. So the Gemara says teku. We're going to have two questions of Rava, then two questions of Rav Ashi. By Rava, second question. This is an interesting one. Talatz mo ba'avir azaramahu. What if you're hanging in the air in the azara? Now, how you're hanging in the air, good question. You're, I don't know, hanging from a rope from the ceiling. Or perhaps it just means you're not on the ground, like you're standing on something. Okay, why should that be a relevant factor? Well, okay, now let's go back to the beginning of brachot. If you remember the beginning of brachot, how do we define time? Often in the Gemara, in words, right? We don't always define time in hours or in minutes, for sure not in minutes. They didn't really talk in minutes. But many times you have descriptions of time. We have them in words and not in time. So here, right, we have a description which I tried to put into a number because it's easier to understand it in a matter of 2 minutes, okay, even though I don't really know how long it is. Could be longer. But the rabbis often define things in words. Now, the question is why? So I go back to the beginning of bracha, right? When do the Kohanim, when do people read Shema at night? When the Kohanim, the same time the Kohanim would be allowed to eat truma after going to the mikveh in the morning, and then they wait till the sunset, right? And they really wait till the three stars come out, and that's the same. Why do they define it in words? So sometimes they define it in words because that's how they discuss time, right? Time is just discussed differently than nowadays. Sometimes they discuss it in words because the words are very relevant. Like I'll give you another example. How long do we wait between milk and meat? Okay. So one of the answers in the Gemara is from meal to meal. Okay. Then later the commentary said, what's meal to meal? That's what we have. 6 hours, 5 hours, right? And then even the later opinion of 3 hours or 1 hour, right? It all depends how your meals were. And that is a relevant, right? It's between meals. It is a relevant description because it's saying, okay, you're between one meal to the next meal. Is it supposed to be defined in time, or is it supposed to be defined between meals? If you're, one day you decide to eat a meal earlier, maybe, right? So these questions come up in all these sugyot. So now the question is, when we say Kadesh Shachavad, the time it takes to bow, so do we say Ki Gemire Shihia Debati Shachavad? When we say you waited in the temple the amount of time you could have bowed, it's because you could have bowed. Now, if I'm up in the air, I can't bow at that moment. So maybe the time I'm in the air, or again, on some higher area or something, like on a peg or I don't know what, but that I can't theoretically bow, maybe that time isn't counted because it's all the matter of could I have bowed in the temple? And because right? And that's the issue. But if I couldn't have bowed at that moment, maybe it's not relevant. Odilma bifnim shia gamre gemire lo shna debati shtachava v'lo shna dela bati shtachava. Or does that have nothing to do with that? Does it all just have to do with the amount of time? It doesn't matter if I could have bowed or couldn't have bowed. It's just saying I'm inside the amount of time it could have taken to bow. It doesn't matter if I'm up in the air. It doesn't matter if I'm on the ground. Either which way, I've overstayed my allotted time. Teku, again, we don't have an answer. Those were the two questions of Rav, and now we move on to the two of Rav Ashi. By Rav Ashi. Now, interesting. Which started, Rav's question was about malkot. Malkot was intentional. But there we talked about I became impure unintentionally. And then I was warned, if you don't get out of here, you'll get lashes. And that part became intentional. But now Rav Ashi changes the first part to intentional. What if I intentionally brought tumah upon myself in the temple? Like there was a sheretz there and I touched it to myself on purpose. So now, mahu, do we say, ba'ones gemira shehiyah, the whole issue of she is only if I accidentally became impure, and everything we've been learning is only if I accidentally became impure. B'mezi lo gemira shehiyah, but in mezi there is no shehiyah, so I made myself impure. I stay there for a second, I've already done something wrong, and I now have to, in this case, I would get lashes or I would get karet for doing it. O Dilma, bifnim gemirashia lo shna ba'ones lo shna b'mezid. Or maybe it all has to do with shehiyah is all, right? It's a requisite amount for being in the temple while impure. It doesn't matter whether I made myself impure on purpose or I got there accidentally. Either which way, until I've stayed that requisite amount, I haven't done anything wrong. So if I put a sheretz on myself in the temple and rush right out, theoretically, maybe I'm not obligated, even though I did something intentional. So again, Teku, we don't have an answer to all these questions. Next question of Rav Ashi. Now we're going to go to a totally different topic. And you'll see how they shift the same things we've been saying all along. Is it bifnim? Is it mazid? Is it ones? Okay, so now we're going to say nazir bekedem. Let's say you have a nazir who goes into a cemetery, but the nazir went into the cemetery in a box. Okay, so he's carried in a box, which means if you're in a box, the impurity of the cemetery is not going to get to you, and it's not a problem. Remember, a nazir can't become impure, just like the kohanim, which we read yesterday. So the nazir, right? We read about the kohanim yesterday in shul. Now I'm talking about nazir. Same issue. Can't become impure to a dead body. But if you were brought into a cemetery, someone carried you in this box, and you're not impure, but then they broke the box or something, or they took it apart in a way that now the impurity gets to the nazir. And the nazir now, it's like being in the temple, and all of a sudden you became tamei, right? He was in the cemetery, and all of a sudden he becomes impure. Now, if they say, hello, you're a nazir, you're in a cemetery, get out of here right now. And let's say he hesitates the amount of time it would take to bow, okay, is that a relevant amount for the nazir in a cemetery? In other words, do we copy and paste the requisite amount of bowing in the temple to this situation? Because it's a similar situation. Now, of course, bowing has absolutely nothing to do with being in a cemetery or anything else. Bowing obviously has to do with someone in the temple could bow. That was an action they could do. So again, is this a requisite amount that really has nothing to do with the bowing itself, or it's specifically, right? It's kind of like the guy who was up high in the temple in the air and couldn't bow. So do we say, Bifnim Gemire Shihya? Now we're going to take the same thing we kept saying before. Oh, it doesn't matter, Mezid Shogeg, it's all just about being inside the temple. But now we're taking that question, we're flipping it. We're saying, that's a shiur of in the temple. It's a very relevant shiur, requisite amount for the temple itself. But outside the temple, a nazir in a cemetery, what's the connection? Lo Gemire Shihya. We don't learn this amount of waiting. Odilma, or do we say no? But ones gemira shehiyah lo shna b'fnim lo shna b'chutz. Remember, we kept saying, is it ones only, or is it also mazid? Maybe the topic is just anytime you accidentally get yourself into a status and now you have to leave, we give you a certain amount of time to be able to leave before we're going to obligate you. And then it would apply just as well to the nazir. So these are very fascinating questions. Unfortunately, we don't actually have any answers to them, but we end again in teku. So those are the first four questions. And those are all related to the Shiur Kadesh Tachava. Now, again, I'm going to remind you, and this is going to be important to understand for the next part. There's two parts of it. One is how long did you stand there not doing anything, right? And then you start walking. So if you stay under the amount of Kadesh Tachava, and then you start leaving the temple, if you leave on the short path, you're okay. If you leave on the long path, you're not okay. Well, now we're going to ask some obvious questions, okay? Like, what if you walk like a turtle out the short path? Or what if you run like a rabbit outside, right? Out the long path. And you do it in less time or the same amount of time it would have taken you to take the short path. Is this okay? And the basic question is this an issue of time or is it an issue of path chosen? And it doesn't matter how long it takes you to walk that path. It's just a matter of did you go the short way or the long way? You can think about what you think your answer is going to be. This one we're actually going to have an answer for. Amar Rav, קצרה שאמרו, אפילו עקב בצד גודל, ואפילו כל היום כולו. Rava says, when we say short, we mean the short path. It doesn't matter if you go heel to toe, meaning very slowly like a turtle. And even if you did it all day long, it took you the entire day to leave, it doesn't matter. It's not a factor of time. It's a factor of path chosen. By Rav. But Rava now asks, Shehiyot mao sheyitztarfu. Now, that's why I said before, what does it mean to walk slowly? Well, you're in motion, okay? There's the in motion and there's the stopping. Now, if you stop and you're just standing there, kadesh takava'ah, the amount of time, let's say that 2 minutes, you're obligated, even if you take the short path. So what if you're going outside on the short path, but you stop? And then you keep going, and then you stop, and then you keep going, and then you stop. Do we account all those stops and join them together? And if all together, all the times you paused and stopped, we add them up. And if you're at 2 minutes, let's just assume 2 minutes is the amount, then you're obligated. Is that the case? Okay, that's what he wants to know. Shiyot mao shiyitztarfu. Every time you take a pause, is that going to count? So the Gemara says, "V'tifshot lemedide." Why doesn't Rava answer it from his own question, from his own words? He said, even if you walk very slowly. Now, the assumption is very slowly means, right, if you said kol hayom kulo, the whole day, you must have taken breaks, and your breaks must have been altogether, if you add them all up, more than the time of Kadesh Shachma'ah, and yet he says you're fine. So it sounds like we don't count them together. To which the Gemara says, no, hatam b'delo shaha. That's why I brought the example of a turtle, because a turtle can be constantly in motion and still take all day to leave, right, on this short path. So what it means is, when Rava said that, what he meant is, as long as you're constantly in motion. If you were to stop, perhaps, we don't know what he would say, but we can't learn the answer to, do your breaks all add up, even if they're separated by movement, because we don't know what he would say in that case, because theoretically, he could have meant when he said about the short steps, that you're just constantly walking, and you're never taking a break, and then this has nothing to do with that. So we have an answer to one question, but we don't really have an answer to the second one. Now Abai asked Rabba the following question. Same kind of idea as I mentioned before. What if you went the long way, but you ran really fast and you're a very fast runner and you did it in less time than the short way or the same time as the short way? If you did it the same time as the short way, right? Let's say the short way takes a minute and your long path, which normally takes 2 minutes, took you a minute. Would that be okay? Would you not be obligated? Odilma, so now, so then they say here, so do we say Shiur Gemire? Is it all just the amount of time? Right? When they said long, short, they really meant the amount of time it takes to get out the shortest way. So whether you take the long path or the short path. And therefore, if you went the long path in the short amount of time, you'd be fine. Odilma dafka Gemire, or maybe it's dafka, meaning short is short path, long is long path. It doesn't matter how long it takes you. And then, if you take the long, you're going to be obligated no matter what. It doesn't matter how long it took you. And the ktsara, you be patur. Doesn't matter, right? Again, like Rabba, doesn't matter how long it took you. Amar le lo nitna aruka lidachot etzlo. So Rabba, this isn't Rabba who answered before, this is Rabba. Rabba says, he answers Abaye, you can't go on the aruka no matter what. That's what it means. Lo nitna aruka lidachot elav. You can't take the long path no matter what. Even if you were able to do it in a really short amount of time, no. You were not allowed to take the long path. You have to take the shortest path possible, and doesn't matter how quick you could get out the long path. Well, Matkipla Rabbi Zera. Rabbi Zera comes with a question. He's going to try to knock out Rabbi's opinion. In the end, he won't be successful, but it's going to take us a little bit to understand his question. He's going to bring a totally different halacha, not totally, but different halacha. And he's going to try to say that there's no way to establish this according to what you said. Okay? So Rabbi Zera says this. Ela de kaimalan. There's a halacha that we know about, which is, it's established for us. That's what it means kaimalan. Tamei sheshimesh b'mita. If you have a person who's impure, who's in the temple, and they do avoda in the temple, they do one of the ritual actions, they do some sort of action. We'll talk about what this could be later, but they do a ritual action in the temple while they're impure. So we have a Kohen, right? Again, apropos our parsha this week, we have a Kohen who's working in the temple, but they're impure, and they do an action of work in the temple while they're impure. They get death in the hands of God. Now, what's the case? Because first of all, let's assume you didn't wait the amount of time, the requisite amount. Well, if you didn't do the requisite amount of hishtachava'ah, let's say, right, bowing, and then, okay, we're going to say like this. First of all, what avoda in the temple could take less than the amount of time to bow? Like the amount of time to bow is pretty much about the shortest action you could do, although we'll see maybe not. But right now they're going to suggest it's about the shortest action you could do. So there's no way that he didn't wait shiur shtachava'ah. Okay, there's no way. Which means, right, so he couldn't have done an avoda if that's the case. So it definitely isn't that he didn't wait. Now, ida shaha, if he waited, and then let's assume he took the shortest path, but because he was there, the amount of time, and while he did the avoda, that was considered waiting, the amount of time it takes to bow, because he wasn't on his way out, right? As long as you're not on your way out, it's considered the shiur shiyah. Well, bar karetu, he wouldn't get death by the hands of God. He would get a more severe punishment of karet, right? Because what's our topic? Our topic is korban olah v'yored, which if you did it unintentionally, you get karet. But if you did it intentionally, you would get karet. That's why we talked before about getting lashes. Because remember, if it's karet, you could get lashes. If they warn you for lashes, you'll get lashes. So you can't, if a kohen sheshimesh, who's tameh. So we have a person who's in the temple, did avoda, was there kadesh tachava, and then left on the short path, they're going to be liable because they were already there, right? You have to be under in the time of shehiyah and take the short path. So this person, let's just put our numbers to it. It means 2 minutes of bowing, right? The amount of time it would take to bow, and 1 minute of walking out on this short path, let's say. So you're already at 3 minutes, basically, because you did an action, which we assume took you 2 minutes, and in the quickest possible way, you got out the shiur k'tzah. So now, if you did all that, you'd be chayav karet, because even though you went the short path, you were already there, kadesh shachava, which obligates you karet. So you can't say this tameh guy who worked in the temple gets death by the hands of God. He actually gets karet, which is worse than that. So now we have a problem, because how does this case make any sense that you could get death by the hands of God and not karet? So, well, if you say it's all about the 3 minutes, it has nothing to do with shiur k'tzara, shiur aruka, right? It's all about the 3 minutes, which we already said is not the case, right? This is why it's going to create a problem. But he says, I could find you a case where you're going to get death and you're not going to be obligated karet if we go by a number like 3 minutes, because what could you do theoretically? The avoda we assume takes you 2 minutes. You can't cut there, but what can you do? You can run out the short path and then be under the 1 minute of the short path. If it's all a numbers game, you could do it. So that's what we're going to read right now. Now, this is going to work if you say shiur gemire, that it's all a matter of time. Time. Okay, which again, that, by the way, that time will fluctuate depending on where you are in the temple and where the door is, right? But we're going to go by the shiur k'tzara is the shortest, right? Whatever time it will take in that space for you to get from where you are to the door will take, let's say, a minute or a minute and a half, right? And the long path will take you 2 minutes. So we're going to say it's a minute and a half in that case, let's say. So, don't be confused. Anis here doesn't mean onus, like we normally say. Anis means he pushed himself, ran really fast, right? In other words, he ran out the short path after he did the avoda. So he does the avoda, that takes him the 2 minutes. He runs out the short path, which he does in half a minute, let's say. And then we can see why he wouldn't get karet, and that's the case where he's going to get death by the hands of God. Turning now to Amabet, but we're going to say, but it doesn't work if you think tzaraz, tzaran, arukaz, arukan, it all is just the path you took. Because Iyamar dafka gemire, dafka means it meant tzara, it meant arukah, it meant the path. It has nothing to do with time. Then hechem ishkachala, then you couldn't possibly have a case. Because again, we assume the work, we can't cut there. The work is the work. It has to take a certain amount of time. And then we can't cut on the time because it's not a time factor, the Ktsaran Arukan, you won't have a case. And that anytime this case happens, you're going to end up with karet, and you're not going to get death in the hands of God. And then how could there be this halacha that a tamesh shimesh gets death by the hands of God? So therefore, he says, Rabba, you said that shiur is shiur, that it's literally, right? And that's what he said, right? Dafka kamire. Amarle veloni na rukali dachot, right? You can't run the fast path. And also Rava, who said it before Rava, right? Also about the short path, you can't, right? You can't, you can go slowly. It's not a matter of time. This is really a difficulty with both of them. But comes Abai and he says, no, this is not difficult at all, because you can try to figure out already. Amar Abai, my kusha, mishkachala kigon shabbat tzara, va'afach betzinora. You went out the short path, and that's not an issue of time, but you can cut on the time of the avoda. Who says avoda has to take the same amount of time as bowing? I can give you an avodah that you could do, an action that a Kohen who is impure could work in the temple and be liable for working in the temple while they're impure, like taking a fork or something, and or tongs or something like that, and flipping the meat on the fire, on the altar. Okay, so we have meat burning on the altar that has to be burnt on the altar, like let's say a korban ola, the whole thing gets burnt, and the Kohen comes, flips it, which takes a few seconds, right? It's not a very long avoda, flips it, and then goes out on the short path. Whether runs, walks, slow, it doesn't make a difference. Then they're not going to get karet because they weren't there kadesh shachava'ah, but they will get death by the hands of God because they were impure and worked in the temple. And this would have to follow Rav Huna. Uchid Rav Huna. Ta'amar Rav Huna, zar shipech b'tzinora chayav mita. Because Rav Huna says that, okay, now switching to a different topic, but it has to do with this haficha b'tzinora. What we want to prove right now is that flipping the meat on the altar is considered work in the temple. And how do we know it's considered work? Because another thing that defines work, number one, an impure Kohen can't do it and will get punished. But a different thing about it is if a non-Kohen does it, they're liable. You can't, if you're not a Kohen, you can't go do work in the temple, right? The only thing you can actually do is slaughtering, and right, in most sacrifices can be slaughtered by a zar, by a non-Kohen, but any of the other work, avodot, you can't do. So if we define this and say a zar who does this will get punished, will get the death penalty because it's death by the hands of God, then that means that it's considered an avoda. And then for the other issue, it can also be, right, because there's one is a kohen shenitma, and the other is a zar that does the work, a non-kohen who does the work. In both, right, so we're basically going to take Rav Huna about the zar and say, oh, obviously that applies the same to a kohen sheshimesh. Okay, and that answers the question that instead of trying to cut on the time of the path taken, which is not relevant, because Rava and Rava both seem to think it's all about the path. It doesn't have anything to do with time. We can cut here in our case and say, oh, it must be he did the avoda quicker than Kadesh Shachaba, and that's why he wasn't obligated karet, and that's why he'll get the death by the hands of God, because he was intentionally became impure in the temple and then did an action, right? Worked in the temple. Now we just want to understand this halacha of Rav Huna and why he thinks that flipping meat is considered avodah. Like in general, we talk about avodot, it's shchita, which we already said. Usually the zar can do that also. It's collecting the blood, it's sprinkling the blood, which by the way, collecting the blood also, one of the achronim asked that question. Collecting blood doesn't take very long. Also a very quick activity. Collecting the blood, bringing the blood to the altar, pouring the blood in the altar, right? Those are all actions, burning the meat on the altar. But this is just flipping. It doesn't really sound like a major action. So gufa. Now let's go into the statement of Rav Huna. I'm Rav Huna. Zar shepech b'tzinor chayav mita. So that's what we just learned. If a zar, non-Kohen, does this, they're liable to death penalty. Hechidami, what's the case? If he didn't flip it, it wouldn't have gotten burned on the altar. Okay, it would never, like it's a big piece of meat and somehow it would never burn at the top. Pshita. Well, it's obvious then that it's an avoda. In other words, any avoda that helps the meat to burn, if it wouldn't have burnt otherwise, is obviously part of a major part of the avoda because the meat has to be burned on the altar. And if it wouldn't be burned other than flipping it, then obviously it's that, and Rav Huda wouldn't need to tell you that. And if he didn't flip it, nami ma'akle, it would have gotten burned anyway, then my kavid, then that's not an avoda either, because he didn't do anything, right? It was an irrelevant action. So the answer, what Rav Huna was talking about, is lo tzricha di'ilo hipech bahu ma'akle b'tar teshai v'hashta ma'akle b'chad shate. If he hadn't flipped it, it would have burnt in 2 hours. And what he did was he made it burn in 1 hour. And because of that, hakamash malan dechol kiruve avoda avodahi. From that, we learn that anyone who makes something happen quicker in the temple is considered an avoda. And that's what he's referring to. So someone who flipped it, and by flipping it, it made it cook quicker, which usually is what happens, right? It made it burn quicker. So because of that, this is considered avodah. Okay, that was an aside. Now we're going to have 2 more to go to finish up today's daf. We're going to go off to something totally different, and then we're going to bring a braita to support the statement of Rabbi Oshaya, which is then going to be connected. That braita will be connected to our topic. I'm a Rabbi Oshaya. We're going now into a different topic of a leprous house. Now, all the vessels in a leprous house are impure. In fact, the pasuk says, and we're going to read it soon, that they tell the Kohen before, if you remember with Mitzorah, going back to a few weeks ago's parsha, they tell, the Kohen determines when the house is a menuga house, it has leprosy. Before the Kohen declares it a leprous house, it's not a leprous house. And therefore the Torah says, a very fascinating pasuk, the Kohen says to them, Pinu et habayit, take all the vessels out of the house, because as soon as I call it a leprous house, everything in the house will become impure. So take all the vessels out so that they don't become impure. Okay, it's like a way of saving people's money. Okay, we see the concern of the Torah for waste, right, ruining people's stuff. By saying take them all out of the house, even though right now the house is leprous, but it's not leprous until the Kohen calls it leprous. Very fascinating halacha. Anyway, that's one thing. But now we have a person who comes into a leprous house. Now, a person who walks into a leprous house becomes impure. Okay, and they have impurity for a day. It says on the pasuk, Habal abayit, the one who comes into the house, Kol yemei his giroto, all the days where the bayit is a leprous house, and it's called muzgal, Yitmada erev. They have impurity for a day. So now Rabbi Oshaya says, first he introduces what he says with a little introductory sentence. Be'ina de'ema milta, I want to say something, this halacha. But I'm a little scared of my friends. What does it mean I'm scared of my friends? I'm worried they're going to tell me I have a problem with, there's a problem in what I said. So first we're going to have to see what he wanted to say, and then what is the issue in what he said. If you walk backwards into this house, so you back into the house, not walking normally, actually, derech achorav, now that I think about it, maybe derech achorav is not backwards, but it's from the back door. Actually, just realized that maybe I misunderstood that. Just check. But if you walk into this house in an atypical manner, okay, I'll just check for a minute if I can find this. Backward. I wonder what it means. Backward. Could be it's actually walking backward. Okay. Yeah, no, it means backward. Okay. So from what I understand, it means walking backwards. So I walk backwards into the house. Okay. Yeah. Oh, it obviously means backward. Okay. Got confused here for a minute, but it definitely means backwards. And now we're going to see why. Because if you walk in backwards, okay, and afilu kulo chutz mi chotmo, everything goes into the house except for your nose. That's why it's obviously backwards. Just got confused for a minute. So you walk in backwards, and every part of your body is in the house other than your nose. Now, you might remember we have all these stories about Rosho and Rubo in the sukkah, right? Most of your body's in the sukkah, well, right? There's all sorts of sukkahs about the majority of your body. So basically, the majority of your body's in the house. In fact, really almost the majority. You're just missing your nose. And you've walked in backwards into that house. Tahor, okay, this is what he wanted to suggest, that you're pure. You don't become impure. Why not? Because it says you went into the house. Okay, it specifically says one who goes into the house. One who goes into the house is one who goes into a house in a typical way. Most people enter their house walking forwards, not walking backwards. So you didn't enter the house in a typical way. Now, remember what he said. This sounds like a pretty decent halacha. So why did he say Mistafina Mechavre? Well, Mistafina Mechavre, I was worried about my friends because I was worried they were going to say, Ihachi kulonami. Well, then it shouldn't make a difference whether your nose is outside the house. Your whole body, even if you walked into the house backwards and entered the house completely and you're sitting in the middle of the house, still you should be pure. Because right, what's the difference if your nose is outside or your nose is inside? Either which way, you went into the house. And when to become impure? If you walk into the house. And you didn't walk into the house in a typical manner, so this shouldn't be considered walking into the house, and you shouldn't become impure. So I'm a Rava. Rava's going to resolve his difficulty that he was worried that people were raised with him and saying, no, that's not a problem. Kulo lo gara mikelim shababayit. If you got your whole body in the house, you'd be no different than vessels in the house. As the pasuk says, now you have to understand, it should say b'yitma kol asher b'bayit, right? Everything becomes impure. But they're quoting the pasuk that says, get everything out of the house before the Kohen declares it impure so that they don't become impure, okay? But that means that once the house is declared leprous, anything in the house, either it was in the house at the time or comes in the house, it doesn't matter how it got into the house, if it's completely in the house, it will become impure. And that will include humans as well. So the Baal Abayit only comes to say, if you walk into the house, imagine you walk in forward and your leg is still outside the house, okay? So then you'd still be considered a Baal Abayit because most of your body's in the house and you walked in the normal manner. And even though it's not included in Kol Asher B'Bayit because your whole body's not in the house, but since you walked into the house, you become impure. But if you walk in backwards and a little bit of your body is still outside the door, like your nose sticking out, then you're not going to become impure because you walked in an atypical manner. It does have anything to do with our topic. Well, we're going to bring a braita now to prove Rabbi Oshaya. Rabbi Oshaya, what he wanted to say, they're now going to say, here, we have proof, you're right. Tanya namihachi, gagim halalu. Now, there were roofs above the asara, and there were roofs above these lishakot, these chambers that were around the asara. These roofs, all the things that we do in the azara, like slaughtering all sacrifices, or eating kodesh kodeshim, right? Only the high level sanctity had to be eaten in the azara. Okay, all that is not done in these roofs. Okay, you can't. It doesn't have the sanctity, even though it's the roof of the azara. It doesn't have the sanctity of the azara. Only the azara itself has it. The part above it, the roof, doesn't have it. So if you're standing on the roof, you can't do what normally you could do in the Azara. You can't slaughter animals, and you can't eat the higher level sanctity items that can only be eaten in the Azara. Now, tamei, here's the relevant part. V'tamei shenichnas derech gagim lahechal patur. If you're impure and you go into the Azara, you're gonna be punished for that. You're gonna get karate. However, if you went through the roof, which is not a typical way of getting into the Azara, usually you walked in the gate. Okay, you go through the roof, you're exempt. Why? Again, don't come into the mikdash. What does tavo mean? Derech bi'as Torah. Torah forbade normal way of going. If you come in through the roof, that's not considered bi'as mikdash. So theoretically, you could come into the mikdash while you're impure intentionally and not get karate for it. Okay, now I think it was here I saw that the rabbis maybe give you lashes for this. Okay, you shouldn't do this, but you're not going to be obligated the Torah obligation of coming into the temple. And that supports Rabbi Oshaya, who said when it says ubal abayit, it's the same as here, right? Elamikash lo tavo, the same language of coming in. Coming in has to be a typical way of coming in. If it's atypical, it's not going to be included in the pasuk. Now we go back to this very strange line in the Mishna. The Mishna said, this is zohi mitzvat aseh shabamikdash she'en chayavin aleh. This is, okay, this thing that we've been talking about, okay, this topic of Yediot HaTumah and all that and coming into the temple, when you're impure, this is a case that you're not going to get, this is the case they talked about, that you're not going to have to bring, and remember, it didn't really say what you're not obligated, but we explained there, this is a case where you're not going to be chayav a par halem davar shel tzibur. Okay, you're not going to be obligated if the rabbis teach something wrong about this, and the majority of the people do according to the erroneous ruling of the rabbis of the court. Then you have to bring this parhilim davar shel tzibur, but not about this. Okay, and it kind of really came out of left field. And then it said also, just to remind you, which we'll see in a minute, but what is a mitzvah aseh? When it comes to nida, that would be like this, right? And then we bring this case where it's similar. So what we're talking about here is a person who was in the temple, became impure while they were in the temple, and then didn't leave in the appropriate time, right? If all this, like, let's say they taught the time wrong and they told people they could stay for 5 minutes, it was really, 3 minutes or 2 minutes or whatever it was, and they taught you could go out the derech harukah, or they taught this is the derech ktsara, and it wasn't. It was the derech harukah, and they taught it all wrong, and people got it wrong. You're not going to bring a paralim davar shel tzibor for this. However, in a nida case, remember that bizarre case where the husband's right, very similar case to this, although completely different. They're having relations. A man's having relations with his wife, and then while he's in the middle, while they're in the middle, she says, "I got my period," and then he goes out immediately without waiting to not be erect anymore. Then we're going to obligate him because he benefited, he got hana'ah, he got enjoyment, pleasure of the exit also. Okay, so we're going to talk about that case in another minute or two. But first, the Gemara asks a very obvious question, which is, Heichakai de Kamar Zohi. Where was the Mishnah standing, the time of the Mishnah, when he was referring to obviously something? But to what was it referring when the Mishnah said, oh, and this is the case that we talked about? Talked about where? Like, this is totally out of left field. To which they answer, Hatam Kai, oh, it was standing in Masechet Horayot, which is our shortest Masechet. We're going to get there in September after our next Masechet Avodah Zarah, which is all about Horayot, teachings of the rabbis that are erroneous rulings, and it's all about Paralim Davar Shel Tzibor. So there it says, and basically what we're saying is our Mishnah is referring back to that. It's fascinating to think, right? Like people just, right, when they wrote the Mishnah, it was like, oh yeah, of course you know the Mishnah Horayot, and this is referring to that. Like, oh yeah, there it mentions this, and here we're going into the details of it. So, ein chayavin, there it says, ein chayavin alaseh v'lo taseh shebemikdash. You're not chayav a parahalim davar shel tzibor on a mitzvah aseh or lo taseh that's connected to the mikdash. And now basically we're saying, and this is the case they were referring to, okay? Ve'ein mevi'im asham taloi alaseh v'lo taseh shebemikdash. And you also don't bring an asham taloi. What's an asham taloi? That's something different. That's when you're not sure if you did this sin or not. Okay, you're not sure. And what do? Since you're not sure if you had done it, you bring a sin offering. But since you're not sure, you bring this asham taloi, and it covers you until such point that you figure out if you did it or not. This is kind of like the thing we saw about, depending on which opinion you held by, but the sirim, the sirezim, the chatat, that it covers you until you find out. So it gives you atonement until then, and then when you find out, you actually have to bring a korban chatat. Now that doesn't apply to this case either. Why not? Because both of those things, the paralim davar shel tzibor and the asham taloi, are only if you had done it, definite, right, and you knew you did it, you would bring, or it wasn't done because of an erroneous ruling of the rabbis, but you made the mistake, then you would have brought a chatat, a kavua chatat, a chatat as regular sin offering. Remember, our sin offering is a sliding scale offering in the case where you're obligated. On sliding scale offerings, we learned this already, that they're lighter really because you can do, and you don't have to bring an animal. You can bring up birds, you can bring a meal offering, and therefore they're less severe, which means that, and that's what they're saying, the asham taloi and the paralim davar shel tzibor only come when it's a regular set chatat of an animal, not the sin offering of the sliding scale. And that's why these don't apply. But anyway, the point of what they were saying is, this is a reference to that Mishnah, which said you don't have paralim davar shel tzibor or asham taloi on mitzvot aseh and lo taseh that have to do with the mikdash, and they're saying that's our case. And then now we're going back to the continuation of the Mishnah, and because they're actually still quoting the Mishnah in Horayot, and it says aval chayavin alaseh v'lo taseh shebenida umevi'im asham taloi alaseh v'lo taseh shebenida. Okay, and then they quote the second part of that Mishnah, which is like the second part of our Mishnah, the Kamar, and this is what it was saying. Zoe mitzvah taseh shebemikdash ein chayavin aleh, ve'ezohi mitzvah, right? So that's the one that we were referring to there. And now our Mishnah is relating to the second part of the Nida also, which is ezohi mitzvah taseh shebenidash chayavin aleh. Now there they didn't describe it. Our Mishnah is describing what is the mitzvah taseh Nida they were referring to, and that's the case we described already. Hayam shamesh mateorah, he was sleeping with a woman who was pure, didn't have a period yet, but amralo nitmeti, and in the middle she says, I became impure. Uperesh miyad, and he goes out right away. Chayav b'pnei shitziato and alo kibiato. Right, so the end is pleasurable for him, and therefore he's obligated in that. Now we're going to see some statement of Abaye in the name of some rabbi and Rava in the name of another rabbi, and we're going to try to understand what they said. And we're going to wait till tomorrow to really understand this. Itbar. It was said, Abaye Amar Mishmei to Rabbi Chia bar Rav, Chayav Shtayim. He has to bring 2 sacrifices for this action. V'chein Amar Rava Amar Rav Shmuel bar Shva, Amar Rav Huna. Okay, so Rava passed in the name of him, who passed in the name of Rav Huna. Chayav Shtayim. And he explains it a little better. Chada Aknisa, Chada Prisha. Why 2 sacrifices? One for going in and one for going out. Okay, now even though she wasn't impure at the beginning, so it's a little strange. Why would he be obligated on the entrance? We understand that when he goes out, we already explained that. So they're going to have to understand. Harabe Rabba b'mai. So Rabba says, what's the case exactly? Why is he? They want to figure out why he's liable too. And with this, we're going to end. If it's because she was expecting to get her period that day. There's all this halachot about when a woman's expected to get her period, the couple has to separate. So if we're talking about that, and ubeman, what kind of person are we talking about? We have to find a case of shogeg, okay? Because we're obligated to sacrifice. So if we're talking about a Talmid Chacham, okay, who knows the halacha, we understand that she was expected to get her period. We're going to obligate him a korban because it wasn't exactly his fault. Okay, it wasn't really mazid because she wasn't impure yet. And he thought, I can do it before she actually gets her period, right? Reasonable to think she's not going to get her period that second. And that was his mistake. And that's why he brings a sacrifice. Ela prisha ma'ilichayev. But on exiting her body, why should he be obligated? If he's a Talmid Chacham, he should know the halacha that it's forbidden and he has to wait until he's no longer erect and leave then. Mazidhu, which means he'd be intentional. And intentional, if you do something that's unintentionally, you don't bring a korban. So that doesn't make any sense. Okay, and that's where we end our daf. Tomorrow we're going to see what if it was not ma'aretz. That also doesn't make sense. So we're not going to really understand. We're going to have to figure out why 2 sacrifices. Okay, so what did we do in our daf today? We started with these slew of questions. First, we started with the slew of questions about the kadeshiyah, kadesh tachava'ah, the amount of time you stay in the temple of bowing. The question is, does that apply to mazid cases where either you're mazid about not leaving intentionally, or they warned you got lashes? Is it applicable there? Is it applicable if you're high up? Is it right? And you can't even bow. Is it applicable if you're intentional about becoming impure? And is it applicable in a different case entirely of the nazir in the cemetery? And to all those questions, we had no answer. Then we moved to the short and long. We basically defined that it's short and long and has no connection to time at all, which then Rabbi Zera raised a question from the Tamesha Shemesh B'mita. How could you even have a case? It must relate to time because it was done in it, right? The person ran out in the shortest path, and maybe that's why they wouldn't be obligated karet, but they would get for Shemesh. But in the end, we cut the time somewhere else in the action and found an action that takes almost no time, less than bowing, and then we resolved his question in that way. And then from then we moved on to this halacha. Well, then we got into a little bit about this hapach b'tzinor and why that's an action, and it comes from this other case about a zar. From there we went to Rabbi Oshaya, who talked about this halacha he wanted to tell, but he was a little scared that they were going to attack him about it. But then we explained the halacha, and then Rava explained why it's not really a problem about going into the bayit menuka backwards without your nose being in, and basically how you wouldn't be, right? That's not the typical way. And then we brought a braita that supported it by showing also going into the temple is not the typical way, because both of them use the language of bi'ah, coming in. Coming in has to be typical. If you come in an atypical way, when you're like impure and you go into the temple through the roof, you're not going to be obligated, right? Again, not by Torah law. And then we got back to the strange out of context line of this is the mitzvah aseh. What is this referring to? Oh, it's referring back to this Mishna in Horayot. And yeah, this Mishna is kind of a response to that. There it didn't really explain much, and it didn't say what it was, and it didn't say what the cases are. And here we get into, oh, this is the case for the mikdash, and this is the case for the nida. And then we got into this question because these two, both Abai and Rabbi, quoted Rabbi saying, actually, the man in the nida case is obligated 2 sacrifices, and we can't really figure out yet why 2 sacrifices. And with that, we're going to finish for today. Wishing everyone a Shevuot Tov.